Okay, so I believe you all know how fortunate we are to have Jim Mirrlees with us this afternoon at this morning actually, at this academic tribute to Kenneth Arrow. Like Ken, Jim is a towering figure in economic theory. He also is one of the foremost theorists in the field of public finance, having made seminal contributions in such areas as efficient taxation and optimal income taxation. Now, instead of going on with the introduction, I want to try to solve a mystery. Al Roth said that 4 of Kenneth Arrow's students won the Nobel Prize. On the other hand, Ken was heard to say that 5 of his students won the Nobel Prize, and David Arrow in the Stanford obituary mentions that 5 of the students won the Nobel Prize. So what's the story here? Well, after Ken died, I set about to trying to figure out who the 5 students were who won the Nobel Prize, and 4 of them were easy. So Al did the easy job here. John Harsanyi, Mike Spence, Eric Maskin, and Roger Myerson. Those are all easy to get, but who was the 5th mysterious 5th student? And well, Gavin Wright set me on the right path. It turns out that there's an oral history that Kenneth recorded. You can all find it online at Stanford. It's about a 7-hour interview with Kenneth Arrow in 5 volumes. And fortunately, it's organized chronologically, so I tried to figure out what volume I might find the answer to this mystery. And so there's some discussion in his oral history about his 5 students who won the Nobel Prize. Well, it turns out that the place to be in 1963, 1964 was Cambridge, England. And Jim Mirrlees was finishing up his dissertation. Bob Solow was visiting for the year. Kenneth Arrow was visiting for the year. And Kenneth was appointed the external examiner for Jim Mirrlees' PhD dissertation. He had to sign some documentation, and in that sense, Jim was his student. Now, Ken doesn't overclaim. He lays it out rather clearly exactly what happened. In fact, he did the opposite of overclaim. He even said, you know, I was John Harsanyi's advisor, but he didn't need any advice, so I didn't do very much. Anyway, that's the story. That's how he has 5 students who won the Nobel Prize. Now, Jim Mirrlees, or Sir James Mirrlees, is a 2nd-generation Nobel Prize winner because his official advisor, Sir Richard Stone, also won the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, Ken would clarify there is no Nobel Prize in economics. It's the Bank of Sweden Prize in honor of Alfred Nobel. But without further eroding his time, it's my great honor to present Sir James Mirrlees.
Oh, thank you very much for these interesting remarks. I've been puzzled about that missing 5th. But, you know, it's early in the day, and already a couple of people have stolen some of the things I was going to say. Because I wanted to take off from these days in Cambridge. I'd spent a year in India and came back as an assistant lecturer just to locate where I was in all this. And right enough, I hadn't finished my PhD thesis because I'd got entangled with a paper on growth, which of a very different kind from the ones that I was writing, jointly with Nicky Kaldor, who that may be a name now not as well known as it once was. And so I postponed writing the thesis until I came back from India, not to improperly waste the time in India on what it was about, which perhaps is important for this, was optimal saving under uncertainty, which was about to become rather fashionable, but as far as I knew, nobody was doing anything about that. But what I really wanted to talk about was not so much the thesis. That's right, that indeed there were 2 examiners appointed to deal with the thesis and decide whether it was ready to be given a PhD. And I'm not sure that the other examiner read the thesis, but I benefited from the fact that Ken Arrow was there visiting Cambridge for that year, 63-4, as well as Bob Solo, which I benefited from too. But we had to have a session together where I'd be interviewed by the 2 examiners. And I was cross-questioned pretty thoroughly by Ken Arrow. And I think the purpose of these oral examinations for the doctorate is to ensure that you actually wrote the thesis and to ensure that the examiners actually read the thesis. So one of the examiners didn't quite make it on that, but I wasn't going to complain. But at the end of it, it seemed to have gone pretty well, but then Ken, as I now think of him, but I had met him before because it was about nearly Christmas by the time I got this examination set up. But Ken handed me a great thick bunch of pieces of paper saying there are some things that I think you didn't get quite right in the thesis. Could you look at these? And this was a sign of very thorough reading. I recollect in the end being able to produce proofs for all the assertions that I had left there without full proof that he'd picked up in the course of this reading. And that is very characteristic of his approach to whatever he was doing, believing that things should be done very thoroughly. And looking back at that thesis now, I think it was a hard read, but maybe for everybody else other than Ken Arrow. I was certainly very impressed by all of this and relieved that he didn't really catch me out on that occasion. Now, what I can remember from the year was that Arrow gave a course of lectures, full course of lectures on the economics of uncertainty. You'll realize that when he was working on the economics of uncertainty, that perhaps he wasn't always quite as formal. This was more applied theory, very often. And that was, in a way, somewhat surprising, since, of course, I'd already read some of his earlier papers on this kind of thing. Now, they weren't perhaps enormously entertaining lectures, but in my recollection, they were enormously good. That's to say that he was really leading on from theory in the way we've just been talking about in the previous session. And what I want to say is that theory was really very important for Ken. And applications are very important as well. And that was what came out very strongly from that particular course. So I think it was a great experience to get it orally. I didn't know about this oral story of his life on the web, and that sounds like something really worth doing. Now I'm going to go on to some of this. Of course, that lecture course led up essentially to the central content of the paper that was referred to earlier, the Arrow paper, with the rather striking conclusion that in doing analysis of investment decisions in the public sector, one should act in a risk-neutral way, take the expected value of costs, benefits, and not put anything in for risk. I found that an appealing thing, since I'd been approaching a similar conclusion, but I'm pretty sure that I didn't see it as clearly as he already did. But of course, when it was mentioned earlier this morning, it was said that this was in the case where the investment costs and returns were stochastically independent of the other things that were going on in the economy. That side of things actually gets very little emphasis in the paper. And I think that's intriguing. I'm sure that reflects an empirical judgment that, as far as one can tell, it's in many actual cases you don't get the kind of correlation between the returns and the general state of the economy that would be big enough, really much, to disturb the conclusion. But it's quite intriguing to go to the paper and see, thinking of Arrow as the creator of the impossibility theorem in social choice, which I think he wouldn't quite like that description of the theorem. You open the paper, and at once you see a discounted utility written down as the criterion that's going to be used. Since I think any analysis of this kind is addressing the question, how can you come to a particular recommendation in a particular case if you're working as an advisor or an analyst for dealing with the problem? That's to say, it's not, there's a distinction between the kind of problem that says, how will all these things be settled? And the question, how can I work out what I really believe ought to be done? And this is very clearly in that side. And it's because of the great eagerness to be able to contribute to real problems, problem solving, which is very characteristic of Arrow, and something that, of course, I think we should all aspire to. But it's set out very nicely, but it introduces the number of consumers in the economy as a parameter, and very rough and perhaps too rough account would say he imagines that the costs and benefits would be divided up amongst the whole population, and then says if the population is large enough, the importance of uncertainty would be as small as you care to have thought of. In other words, in the limit, as n, the number of people, goes to infinity, you can forget about the importance of risk. And I remain, now, I wasn't then when I first read the paper, but I now remain a little disappointed in this, because it's the if. Is that really the right assumption to make, that there'd be a distribution of costs and benefits amongst the population like that? And this is really quite a central issue in thinking about many decisions for public policy, which is what I'm particularly interested in, and something that Ken became more and more interested in, as far as I can see, over his long and productive lifetime. I prefer in this context, I just mentioned that there are other ways of doing it that don't require you to make an assumption that seems rather arbitrary and very difficult to justify exactly. I wish he would have considered bringing in optimal tax theory as a background for what happens to the changes in government budget that are inevitably brought about on the carrying out of any public project of one kind or another. Of course, for any particular project, you'd say maybe it's going to be rather small. And I don't believe in the end it would disturb the decision. And just like almost any paper that Ken wrote that I've read, gets stimulated by all kinds of further thoughts. Now, of course, because it was Ken who has had this wonderfully broad sense of the nature of the economy, not at all confined to trying to see it in terms of simple markets. They mention in the paper that moral hazard might possibly be quite important, and simply won't deal with it. I'm sorry he didn't deal with it either, because I think the reason why I'm sorry is because I think moral hazard is really quite important for many public sector investment decisions, where a lot of detailed things are going to be carried out by people who are taking decisions later on after the strategic decisions have been taken. And they are going to have incentives which are going to influence quite what they do. And the form of these incentives is going to determine the impact of the project on the overall public budget at different times. My conjecture, which may well have been established in a very large literature that was generated by Arrow's work in this, was that with moral hazard the conclusion would still hold. But as usual, there are some very interesting problems left. So I can see why, as it was suggested, that Arrow was primarily a problem solver, which is something I admire greatly, and I think is partly in the nature of economics. But I remember conversations back in that year when it was clear that he saw it as a very important project that one should develop a rigorous statement of a sort of central core economic theory. It's just that the central core economic theory wouldn't have exactly the status within the subject that general theory in physics would have. I had been thinking in this context of something that happened later, that he and Frank Hahn wrote a book, General Competitive Analysis, which is perhaps one of the harder reads of what Ken has done. But there's some great stuff. And many parts of it really give the best available statement of general equilibrium theory, at least that I've seen. But not all parts. So I, at least, was a bit disappointed in the macroeconomic chapter. They attempt to do something analogous to the Keynesian general theory that would capture these kinds of problems. And that's maybe because nobody can get this straight. But he really cared about having that whole theory well developed. But I do want to end by saying that something else that came from that great year, well, many good economists were involved. But I have to mention that Cambridge at that time tended to have a rather bad-tempered atmosphere. A number of the older economists of Cambridge thought that the important thing to do was to have a good fight. And they were also rather inclined to think that people from outside Cambridge didn't know how to do economics anyway. So, if that hypothesis were to be entertained, I don't need to persuade this audience that it was a false hypothesis, but if you're going to entertain it, at least you should consider trying to persuade people nicely. And it didn't always work that way. However, I do remember Ken giving his medical paper, his health economics paper, to what was called the secret seminar of the faculty members. And they're going over very successfully, partly because one of them found a little error, which they were able to point out. But that's another great example of the sort of thing that Ken did superbly well, which will be talked about later today. Thank you very much.